and welcome to all of our medicine families all around the world. And of course, welcome to all you psychonauts, or perhaps just inquisitive beings, looking to delve a little deeper into the fascinating and somewhat controversial topic of plant medicine with us today. Joining us today is Benjamin De Loenen. He's the founder and executive director of ICES, which stands for the International Centre for Ethnobotanical Education, Research and Service. It's an international non-profit organisation dedicated to transforming society's relationship with psychoactive plants. Ben is also a filmmaker who made an incredible range of documentaries, ranging from Ibogaine Rite of Passage and also Ayahuasca Reframed. Bringing his extensive knowledge to this conversation is ethnopharmacologist, lecturer and author Terence McKenna. Dennis has authored numerous scientific articles and books on this subject and has recently been running a tribute series to commemorate the anniversary of his 20th brother's death. Terence McKenna passing... The McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy is Dennis's most recent venture, which aims to explore modern and traditional practices, ideas and technologies that foster understanding of nature, consciousness, the cosmos, and their interweavings with humanity. He's also a founding board member at the Hefter Research Institute. So thank you both so much for joining us today. If you have any questions from the audience, then we'll hopefully have an opportunity to answer some of those later on in the session. Today we're going to be getting into some technicalities of what defines a plant medicine, how they work, how indigenous communities use them, and perhaps how these plant medicines may fit into a Western medical model. But before we delve into all of that, I wanted to begin a little more in the heart space, in true medicine festival style, and hear a little bit about both of your individual experiences with plant medicine and what took you on this path. You've both absolutely dedicated your life to it. So I think it would be really great to begin the session with that.
All right, perfect.
Well, thank you.
Do you want to start?
Well, thank you, Zach. It's a pleasure to be here. Always happy to appear with my friend Ben. I am a strong, so I'm on the advisory board of ICES, and I'm a strong supporter of everything that they do. They are the, I guess, premier NGO when it comes to these issues of the preservation of plant medicines, access, and also the indigenous cultures and knowledge that support these medicines. So it's always a pleasure to appear with Ben and talk about this work. It's very important.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dennis. It's also a pleasure always to be together on a presentation like this. So yeah, if you want, I can start a little bit about my road or my journey in terms of plant medicine. And actually, I didn't really get into this professionally through a personal experience. It was because I was making this documentary about Ibogaine Rite of Passage, and what it did introduce me, it opened the door to two very different realities. One was kind of the more medicalized environment of addiction treatment with Ibogaine, and then also I went to Gabon and could see for the first time how these plants are integrated in cultures that go back millennia, in communities, and have a central role there. No, so that film really inspired me. I could see the way of alleviating suffering for people with drug dependencies, and I basically was drawn into my heart was kind of really connected to that topic. So I started to give presentations with the film, and then eventually a few years later, at my first ayahuasca experience, and then since then, kind of had various experiences, and have done my first plant dieta recently, and just have seen so much personal benefit that I've of it. But what mostly has inspired me on the road in my journey has been kind of discovering bit by bit really the kind of more indigenous knowledge, the wisdom that's accompanied where these plants have been part of for so long. And seeing that it's not just about molecules or brews, but really, how these systems are so highly sophisticated in terms of community and in terms of relationship with the natural world, and really collaborating in kind of a relationship with these plants for healing and for kind of guidance and learning, for the communities where they come from. So that's really what mostly has inspired me in my journey, where I've received a lot of healing myself.
And Dennis?
Well, yes, I've also been involved in plant medicines and psychedelics for quite a while, going on 45 years, I guess. I came at it from a slightly different direction than Ben. I was a child of the 60s, I guess you could say. I was very interested in psychedelics while I was a teenager growing up in Colorado. And my brother, who was 4 years older than me, was a profound influence on that. He was in California mixing it up in the mid 60s and early 70s, and I was still, at least until the end of the 60s, I was stuck in Colorado. But we both shared an intense interest in psychedelics, and made a pilgrimage or a trip to La Chorrera in 1971. In search of an exotic psychedelic prepared by the Witoto called ukuhe. And we were interested in that because it was an orally active form of, it was orally active, and it contained DMT and other tryptamines, which are usually not orally active unless they were potentiated by a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, as in ayahuasca. We didn't know any of that in 1971. We just stumbled on a paper by R.E. Schultes, the famous ethnobotanist, reporting on this orally active Witoto preparation. And we went to La Chorrera, the ancestral home of the Witoto, in search of this exotic psychedelic, which no one really had any knowledge of at that time, other than this one paper. When we got to La Chorrera, we found that there were psilocybin mushrooms in abundance, because it was a pasture that had been cleared around this mission village. And so we got into those, and they quickly rearranged our priorities. And you can read about all that in the books that my brother wrote. He wrote True Hallucinations, which is the story of that failed expedition. And then in 2012, I published my own memoir called The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. And if you want to know about that part of our lives, you should look at both of those books. Those are effectively required reading. But then in 1981, I returned to Peru this time as a graduate student with the objective of investigating the botany and chemistry and pharmacology of ayahuasca. And actually, in comparison with this Witoto psychedelic, because different botanical sources, but similar constituents, and possibly a similar pharmacology. So that was the basis of my thesis research, my PhD research, and I've been investigating these things ever since. In 1975, my brother and I published a book, little pamphlet really, called Psilocybin Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, which had a much bigger impact on society than we ever imagined, in that it put the tools to grow mushrooms, a very simple method, in the hands of many people. And after I finished my PhD at UBC, the University of British Columbia, I went on to do postdocs, and 3 postdocs related to psychedelic research. And in 1993, I helped organize a biomedical investigation of ayahuasca with the UDV, which is one of the syncretic Brazilian religions that uses ayahuasca as a sacrament. What else? I taught ethnopharmacology at the University of Minnesota, and recently, a year ago, moved to British Columbia, where I actually got my degree 30 years ago. So I guess my main plant teachers, if you want to refer to it that way, well, one of them isn't a plant. One of them is psilocybin mushrooms. The other plant that's been important in my life is ayahuasca, which it's been both an object of professional curiosity, professional investigation, but also to me is a personal teacher. And I'm very grateful to have that relationship with ayahuasca. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you so much for sharing, both of you. It's clear that you both have a huge amount of experience in this field, and we're really blessed to have you join us. I think it'd be interesting now to kind of take it back, to strip it right back, and actually approach this from a perspective assuming people know nothing. Plant medicine is a term that's used a huge amount these days, but I'd love to hear what you guys think plant medicine is defined as. I guess how do they work and in what context? But more so, a plant medicine's something that stimulates a transpersonal or psychodynamic experience or state, or are they non-ethogenic ones too? Ben, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the term plant medicine, I've been for a decade now with ICERs, and even before, thinking like, what is the best way to describe what these plants are, no? And I think so far none of it really has fully captured it, because when we talk about plant medicine, we think about medicine the way we understand medicine, no? More kind of in a biomedical way, which is about personal healing. And then plant teacher is the other word that Dennis just said, and which are plants that teach, no? So traditionally, planta maestra is used a lot in Spanish, and it's really about kind of teaching and healing at the same time. It has to do also with community. Traditionally, it's not so much only individual. So I would say these are special plant species with which humanity has had a relationship for very long, for millennia, in different cultures around the world, and that still until the day of today are very important for that. And these plants really have kind of helped these cultures to maintain a reciprocal relationship with the natural world, to learn. I've been in ceremonies in Colombia, for example, with our friends and partners of the UMIAC. It's an indigenous organization. And you see that even kind of the young people, they also participate in the Ayahuasca ceremonies, the ayahuasca ceremonies. And get teachings out of that and correction of behavior when it's wrong. So they learn about, how to become a responsible member of the community. They talk about problems that they have in the community and how to face it all collectively. So kind of our understanding of medicine and plant medicine is really way more limited than what it really means, kind of more in indigenous context. And I think that's a bit of the issue, because we have boxes. And when something is labeled to medicine, it really kind of goes in that biomedical, box. Or when sacrament, which also these plants are for certain religions, then they go in that type of box. But it's very difficult. We don't have a multi-dimensional box that really, if you look at it from one side, it's a teacher. From the other side, it's a medicine. From the other side, it's kind of a community cohesion tool. But that's really kind of the complex relationships that people have had with these plants for very long. So that's and they tend to be they're kind of psychoactive, and they they induce certain deep states in different ways, different plants. But I think the key element is that they have been kind of plants that have taught, healed, and maintained the community connected to their territory and the natural world for millennia, and that's why they're so important.
Thanks, Ben. And so I just wanted to clarify, because there's all these other healing, for example, mushrooms, lion's mane and chaga and reishi. And so, Dennis, do these fall under plant medicine also, or is it specifically the psychoactive ones?
What would you say, Dennis?
Do they? Well, they're all medicines. It's a fine line, the term plant medicine is really in some ways, I mean, it's a convenient term, but for example, mushrooms and fungi generally are not medicine, or they're not plants, strictly speaking. We can think of them as plants. So right there, it's biologically incorrect. And then there is a tendency, they are all teachers, in the sense that we learn from them, the psychoactive ones. The terminology makes clear is not adequate to the to properly describe what these are. We tend, as he pointed out, we tend to think of the term medicine in very reductionist terms, and put it into that biomedical slot. I think indigenous people use the term medicine also, but they use it in with a much broader understanding. For them, medicine is almost a state that they're in all the time. These medicines in the indigenous context are not only used to heal individuals, but they're used to heal the culture and the society, ultimately even the world. So anything that you do in an indigenous context that you might call medicine, it doesn't even have to involve the ingestion of plants, rituals can be medicines, belief can be medicines. There is that wider sort of, I guess you would say, spiritual potency is ascribed to some of these elements of indigenous cultures. So the terminology is not really up to the task, but it's important. The psychedelic medicines, the psychoactive ones, occupy a special place in cultures. That's not to diminish the importance of the other plant medicines that such cultures may have. Most indigenous cultures, if they live in nature, are aware that they inhabit an ecology, if you will, that is permeated with medicines of all kinds, which may be useful for physical illnesses, mental disorders, and spiritual purposes. These categories are not separate. In that sense, indigenous people are way ahead of biomedicine in the sense they realize that there's a connection between the individual and the society and the biosphere as a whole. And psychedelic medicines can heal on all of these levels. This is one reason why they are so important for the cultural solidarity of these indigenous cultures. One reason why they are such potent catalysts, I guess that's the right term, for opening our eyes to our relationship with nature. And in the case of non-indigenous people, Western people, that eye-opener can be a bit of a shock, but in a good way. It can make people realize how estranged we've become from nature, and resolve to try to overcome that. And so in that sense, they're powerful teachers, not only to individuals, but to global culture. Hopefully the world can learn from this indigenous knowledge and indigenous wisdom and apply it on a global scale. Having said that, I don't have to tell you that the challenges are great, to do that. For example, the two medicines that ICERS is most preoccupied with, most focused on, ayahuasca and iboga, both are under great environmental pressure due to overharvesting, and that's largely a consequence of the ayahuasca Westerners going to South America seeking ayahuasca. I mean, it's the consequence of what amounts to a sincere spiritual impulse, spiritual quest, on the part of many people But when you have many travelers coming to an indigenous culture, it puts pressure on everything. So even though we participate in this, I think we're also, it's a dilemma. You cannot fence these cultures off, and it's not even desirable. Back in the day, we used to have reservations for First Nations people. That's absolutely the wrong approach, because in the modern world, everyone is hyper-connected, even indigenous people. So we have to find a way to bring the benefits of these medicines to a wider world, and yet preserve the societies that have been the stewards of this knowledge for so long, and in conjunction with that, preserve the plants, because the habitats are impacted. The habitats are being decimated, and that happens to be where the people live. It's not only where the plants are; it's where the people live. So we're faced with a whole host of moral and ethical problems here that we have to figure out. And I think, I think that's the biggest challenge, because the world needs these medicines. How can we bring the medicines, or help bring the medicines to the world, without destroying them, destroying the cultures, and all the consequences that has. So and ICERS, to its credit, they're right in the middle of all these issues. They're trying to bring intelligence and compassion to all of these tremendous issues, and there are a lot of problems to solve. The solutions aren't so obvious, but we have to keep trying, because I think Ben and I both share the belief that if anything can save this planet, it's these medicines, because they change hearts and minds. They actually change people's consciousness and help them reassess their relationship to nature. And if they take that lesson home with them, then they can implement changes, perhaps, and actually have an impact on the global scale.
Yeah, I think our disconnection to nature is actually one of the key driving forces behind, Medicine Festival, and why we felt it was so essential, and what we can learn from these indigenous communities, and how vital it is to kind of bring this into Western philosophy. An amazing quote which rung in my head, which I have here. Give me 2 seconds. From Gustav Speth, who is an environmental lawyer. So I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. And I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are greed, apathy, and selfishness. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. And I thought it was really interesting in regards to what you were saying, is that can these chemical messengers, these molecular keys that plant medicine are, can they open up the capacity for us to engage with a deeper state of self-inquiry, and expose ourselves to these unconscious kind of layers of ourselves, and, the profoundly and often uncomfortable kind of realization of who we are and what we're here to do. So I guess, for me, they kind of align us with this universal truth, this kind of, I guess, animist view of oneness, which the indigenous embody, an acknowledgement of the sacred, and that we're connected to our food and our water and each other, and I feel that this vitality has been lost for this march of centralization and this march of technological and materialistic advance. So Ben, do you think it's within the plant medicines that we might find this kind of solution that Gustav Speth speaks of? I
definitely think so, and I don't think it's necessarily so much in the substances by itself. Even though when you have a profound experience with that, it can really open your mind. But what we tend to do in our culture is then also taking that and putting it into the frameworks that we have, in the biomedical framework and so forth, which definitely, it's gonna, open up the minds of many people. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm saying that it's very important, I think, also for us not to be overly focused on the plants themselves, but really on the whole context and kind of the wisdom that goes with it. And for me, a big eye-opener in that sense was when I was in last July in Colombia, in the Putumayo region, with these indigenous communities related to Umiak organization, and did ceremonies in a small community there, in different communities. And so, in one, it's called a Hell Brigade, is something they do. And it's basically mobilizing the dietas. The dietas are the elders, the leaders of the communities, of most kind of life experience and kind of spiritually very strong people to kind of lead the communities. So they mobilize them to communities that are fractured. And so they can, for example, so they believe that the individual, the community, and the territory or the natural world is actually one in the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. While in our world, we have completely separated those. We talk about mental health. We have also even compartmentalized people. If you have an issue, you feel depressed, you go to a psychologist. Maybe it's major depression, you go to a psychiatrist. If you have a heart problem, you go to the heart specialist. And for a certain type of issues, that's definitely a very important and very lucky that we have our allopathic medicine system. But then we have also kind of environmental health is a whole complete different side where you have different organizations working on that. Philanthropy is all separate in those as well. You have then public health is yet another field. So in their communities, I saw that that's really one and the same thing. And when a taita is healing an individual, they're healing the fractures in the community. They're at the same time also healing the territory. And a concrete example is that in those territories, there's a lot of oil under the ground. So, the oil companies very often come and they want to negotiate to have access to the land to do oil extraction. And then sometimes that fractures the community because part of the leadership wants the money, and kind of the shorter term gains that they get from collaborating with these companies. And the other part of the leadership, they don't want that because they understand that they are the territory, and it would harm them, in 100 years would pollute the territory completely. So there's a fracture in the community, and then also there's a lot of trauma because of violence, and even these companies, they hire a hitman, and so people are also traumatized. So it was incredible to participate in a ceremony, where these taitas were healing, but they're not just healing the individuals; they're also healing the fractures in the communities and the territory at the same time. And I've been reflecting a lot about this because we have a very, very fractured society, and as I said, mental health is here, environmental health is there. We seem to have a mental health crisis that we almost, now more and more, but we don't generally connect it to the environmental crisis. And we don't want to see how all of that really is interconnected, and even generationally, even we have, kind of been killing our own ancestors, the indigenous peoples, and been destroying the plants. So there are so many fractures and that have then passed on from generation to generation. I think it's so important that we heal those fractures, and the plant medicine of a big part of that. But really, for me, an alliance, between these more ancestral, the ancestral wisdom, which really points to where we come from, who we are and what our role is in this society and in this life. Connected to then the other side, which is the technology and the fact that we're more than 7 billion people, on this planet. So how do you also do that in a way with so many people? So I think we need the best of both worlds, and plant medicines really, for me, are a big connector in bringing people together. But yeah, we need to have a kind of more comprehensive view, I think, on what plant medicine is, and really want to partner in reciprocal relationships with the indigenous peoples. To really kind of climb out of the big hole that we have, dug for ourselves in this world.
I mean, so you both mentioned the kind of ecological impact of the globalization of these plant medicines. The popularity of ayahuasca and the amount it's spoken about compared to, I guess, 10 years ago is pretty profound. And so I do wonder, how do we approach this? How do we address it? Some argue that perhaps we should only use our native plant medicine, following our own native tradition. We have our own medicines in this country. So how are we addressing this issue? I know around Ibogaine and everything, it's becoming a massive problem for these Aboriginal and indigenous communities.
Well, yes, it is. And as Ben pointed out, these plant medicines, people come, to South America to take ayahuasca and have their own personal revelations, receive their own teaching. But in so doing, by exposing themselves to the culture, if they do so in a respectful way, in a receptive way, they realize that the medicines, the psychedelics, are just a portal for maybe a non-indigenous person to experience the worldview that which for indigenous people is an everyday reality. You know, they understand that these divisions that are so important in our thinking, you know, medicines are not connected with nature and so on. They ignore the, you know, practically every medicine, whether it's psychoactive or not, emerged at some point out of an indigenous context. You know, they have a history and so on. And people that come to South America may be in search of a spiritual experience through ayahuasca. As they become immersed in the culture and exposed to the culture, they realize that it's a much bigger picture that they're, getting involved with. I thought your remark that, that one possible solution to this, if people want these experiences, develop their own medicines from their own biota, wherever they may live. This is actually possible, in the sense that there are, in temperate areas and really everywhere in the world, there are plants that could be utilized this way, you know, based on their pharmacology, their known chemical constituents. What's missing there is the historical context and the cultural context. We are faced with, part of our challenge is to create our own traditions around these medicines, you know, that respects the indigenous knowledge, that maybe incorporates some principles of, of that knowledge, but you can't imitate indigenous practices because we're not indigenous in that sense. So one possible approach to this is, to look into what's available in locally that could potentially be developed as a plant medicine. It's interesting that of the two that we've been talking about, ICERS is basically concerned with ayahuasca and iboga. They don't do so much with mushrooms, but mushrooms is one of the main plant teachers that people encounter. And because they're mushrooms and because they can be grown very easily, there really is no shortage. You know, there's no crisis about mushrooms. Sufficient amounts can be produced using well understood cultivation techniques. So this may be one argument for mushrooms over ayahuasca. Maybe ayahuasca should be available, but maybe its access would be much less than it could be, and mushrooms can potentially fill that gap because, you know, they can be cultivated in very large quantities, and depleting the species is not an issue, which it is with something like iboga or ayahuasca. You know, another approach, something that is going on that I think is encouraging, although it has its own problems, as any potential solution to this does, but I think the decriminalization movements that are going on in the States and elsewhere, mostly at the local level, the declaration that these plants are not criminal, which it should not be regulated or thought of that way. I mean, how can a plant be a criminal? But the decriminalization movements are encouraging in the sense that it may open the way to develop centers or retreat centers in situ in these cultures, and rather than going to South America to take ayahuasca or going to Africa to take iboga, maybe it would be possible to bring the medicines to North America and Europe, form alliances between these local centers if they were allowed to operate out in the open and legally and with reasonable regulation. But, you know, if it was not a issue if it was not a legal issue to operate these centers, then form alliances between the North American, European centers and the indigenous people, and rely on them to produce the plants, and benefit economically from that, but not be overrun by Westerners looking for spiritual experience, which is a completely legitimate human impulse. We seek meaningful experiences, but we also have to keep in mind the impact that has. That's part of becoming a more conscious being, is just realize it's not just you. It affects everybody. I mean, very much the same kind of perspective that we could use about now with the COVID virus, for example. Many, especially the United States, is especially guilty of this. Certain people want to just open it up, just stop this ridiculous isolation and so on. Just let people behave normally, let the chips fall where they may. Well, the chips are going to, when that happens, many more people are going to die, because it doesn't have to happen this way. So I think part of the lesson of COVID is, if people will internalize it, is that an individual's action has an impact. If I choose not to stay isolated, if I choose to go out and mix with crowds, then I infect people, and it spreads out. So this is a very selfish thing, and Americans are all about their freedoms, the whole idea of don't tread on me. What that fails to recognize is that every action you have, that you take in the society, on the environment, and so on, affects other people. And we have a moral obligation to respect other people. It's not just all about what you want, it's all about what we want, what benefits communities and societies and humanity as a whole. We have to get away from this, attitude of, it's all about the individual, and whatever they want is what we should support, and damn the consequences. I think plant medicines are an effective tool for helping us understand the interconnections between everything, between each other, society, nature, and so on. That's where the teaching comes in. It's learning how to be a compassionate human being. In these protest movements, I see a distinct lack of compassion, and of course that's exemplified most by our president, who doesn't do so well on the compassion front, and that influences people, and that's important. So anyway, long-winded answers. I'm famous for those.
And I would also just add, in terms of Iboga, I think, with Iboga is where the sustainability aspect is mostly under pressure, because it's a very small territory. It's mostly in Gabon. I mean, also somewhat in Congo, but Congo is a pretty dangerous country. So, I think most of it comes from Gabon. And many people, they don't really think about where is this coming from, what does my personal experience with Iboga or ayahuasca and so forth, how does that impact the origins, or the cultures where it comes from. And then at some point, probably in the near future, pure kind of synthesized Ibogaine will at some point be available, and the medicalization will then kind of push that forward, and that will take pressure off the original environment. But then also, how do we make sure that there's a reciprocity with the origins, that we understand, and the business, the psychedelic kind of drug development that will appear, will also uphold this interconnectedness of all life, and think of reciprocity. So that's also for us kind of a big thing of our work, really trying to inspire that if reciprocity is really the basis of all what we do, also in the psychedelics field, and as these become more official mainstream medicine, how does that look like? And we just came back, the fall from a collaboration we did with an organization called Blessings of the Forest, It's a UK charity who's been very active in Gabon around the conservation. My colleague visited a small community there, and they have planted iboga, and in a very beautiful kind of community sense. And I think that's also kind of, if you want to address the sustainability of these plants, we need to also look for collective impact. Who are the partners? Where? So in terms of ayahuasca, what are the initiatives? A lot of the churches, they grow their own ayahuasca. There are centers that have started to do this years ago. And then really, I think it's in mutual convening spaces in which people share their experience and also kind of really connect the psychedelics, kind of more medical environment with this more indigenous environment, that also support can flow in all directions, that people can learn from each other, and that they can implement practices in the sense of cultivation and looking into sourcing in a good way, and so I think a lot of work is to do around that, but it's only possible if we also really approach this from more collective impact. Who are the people on ground who are dealing with these realities, and how can we leverage support in all directions so that we are not, our own need for healing is not depleting the botanical resources and negatively impacting the origins of this plant medicine.
Yes, and I think that's this business about reciprocity. I mean, this is a huge issue now. I mean, it's always been a huge issue, but now it's being brought front and center. The West particularly has always approached nature as something that they own, and they have a right to it. They have a right to deplete it. They have a right to deplete these environments. They learn many things from indigenous knowledge, and then the pharma industry goes out and makes billion-dollar drugs from them, which is a great thing because they heal people. They are useful to many people. But the moral aspect of that is there's rarely any acknowledgement that this knowledge had indigenous origins, and there does need to be reciprocity. I mean, this biopiracy has been going on since the Columbian Exchange 500 years ago, where Westerners from Europe came and pretty much co-opted many of the most important New World medicinal plants without even a nod to the fact that this knowledge was preserved for so long. Well, by indigenous cultures, but now we're at a place where psychedelics are being transformed into big business. Pharma is interested in developing pharmaceutical psychedelics for use in clinical practices and all that. I think this is okay. I think it's inevitable for one thing. I think there is a lot that that can be learned from these clinicians by looking at indigenous practices. But on the financial and business level, so many companies want to develop things like psilocybin or ibogaine as medicines, and supposedly the propaganda is, well, we're different, we're not corporate predators, we have open hearts, we're all medicine people, we agree that this is important. What I want to see in these companies is the commitment to put those words into action, to commit to apportion significant amounts of their profits, their investment capital to preserve indigenous knowledge, indigenous cultures, and so on. That's the moral challenge that they have to make if they want to walk their talk. If they really want to do this, then they have to realize the context out of which these medicines come. Sure, develop it as a pharmaceutical drug. Charge people who can afford it huge amounts to go to a clinic and have those experiences. If they can afford it, that's fine. That's beneficial. But remember that most people would rather use natural medicines. And remember also that, we owe a huge debt to these indigenous groups. So I'd like to see the the psychedelic pharma companies that are springing up all over make a commitment to support indigenous people, and organizations like ICERS, is one way they can do that. ICERS is very effective in being the liaison, between the Western world and indigenous people. On a more modest way, I would say the McKenna Academy. This is also its mission. And we would like your support too. But ICERS has been around longer time and doing just incredibly effective work. So, visit both websites, please, and educate yourself about it. So that's a big challenge that we're facing.
Amazing. Well, I think it's a really good point, that you're bringing these into a Western model of philosophy often strips them of their sacred or ceremonial aspects, I guess, in a typically imperialistic way to dissect and analyze and regulate everything. But I wanted to kind of delve a little bit more into how it works, how these fit into public health in the West. I know it requires systemic and institutional change, but there's been a bunch of studies. I know in early 2000s there was a John Hopkins study, and it showed an 80% decrease in depression, anxiety, and various things. But about a year ago in the UK, the Imperial College launched the first Centre for Psychedelic Research. I know by Robin Carhart-Harris, and reading some of the research myself, it shows that they're set to have a major impact on neuroscience and psychiatry in the coming years, but we're still in this process. And I know, Ben, that you, from an ICERS perspective, have been working on a range of clinical studies around alcoholism and Ibogaine sort of curing addiction in a broader sense. So I wanted you to delve a little bit into how that works and how those studies are going and how you see the future.
Well, these studies, what you refer to, they were set up, but they haven't started yet. We were about to, and COVID hit, so it's been postponed until whenever we can. But yeah, this is gonna look into the potential of Ibogaine for in more repeated lower to mid dose range sessions for people with opioid dependent, and then in Brazil one with for alcoholism at our partners at Ribeirão Preto. In terms of Ibogaine, the medical subculture has been around for very long, and all of the more anecdotal evidence shows, and I saw this myself when I was making my documentary, how even a test dose was reducing or taking away completely withdrawal from people with very significant, opioid dependencies. Some had been using for 20 years or more. There's definitely something unique to Ibogaine in terms of drug dependency. The thing is that there's never been clinical trials that are done for the treatment of drug dependency. There's one group in Holland that started, but they haven't published anything yet. So we eventually achieved to get permission of the ethics committee to do more like an exploratory proof of concept type study into how does Ibogaine behave in more kind of hospital laboratory setting. But given in a protocol which really Claire Wilkins, who's an Ibogaine practitioner, has kind of pioneered in moving from really building up a bit of a tapered down type way of working. So we hope to start. We're supposed to start in February, but hopefully in maybe June or if in worse after summer. And we'll see if the results are as hopeful as we expect. And then we've been involved in a lot of more observational research as well with ayahuasca. We did a three-year study at the Temple of the Way of Light and just published first paper around grief. So looking at the group of grief, which I think is a very big understudied field. No, we all have at some point grief in our life, and we lose a loved one. And the vine of the dead or the vine of the soul, kind of logically, is something which can really, help people connect to that issue. But we also, looked at people with PTSD, with anxiety, depression, and then a lot of, even though most of it is really medicalization around pathologies, PTSD, which and depression are the two main ones, psilocybin for depression and MDMA for PTSD, as MAPS has been pioneering. But I think, in terms of well-being, people who not necessarily have a pathology, but just can also benefit from the studies. We've looked at public health. We did a public health study as well, looking at a sample in Spain of people who used ayahuasca, and just looking at what does it look like if you compare that with the general population in terms of public health, no? And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot to study, and a part of the kind of more psychiatric or mental health focus. I think it's also equally important to look at more kind of how can these plants and these practices benefit people in key moments in their life. Around fear of death is another one, no? And dying, but also kind of important issues like losing a loved one or others. I think there's yet a lot to discover, and then also for me, I think what would be really interesting that happens more is when people who are kind of trained in our biomedical model open up and become very curious to see how does a Shipibo healer, Onaya healer, do his kind of cosmic surgery, if you want to call it like that, and the whole sophistication of for example, the plant dietas, or the healing work with the Icaros, which if you have gone through that yourself, this is not just music like we think of it. It's really kind of more like a knife that's used in a surgery intervention. So it's like also how can we learn from the technology, healing systems that are part in more the indigenous world in a reciprocal way, where it's not just looking for knowledge and then extract it, but in that dialogue, to kind of advance and really revolutionize our understanding of health. That's what I'm personally really getting more and more excited of.
Dennis, do you have any reflections on that?
Yes, I think this is a very important topic to highlight because, as Ben says, it's not just the medicines. The medicines are important. The tendency of the Westerners, the clinical approach, is to just take those out of context and use them in a clinical setting according to their own, what they're used to doing, but they miss a lot. They give up a lot, I guess you could say, if they take that approach. I've often said you can't reduce these things to crystals and capsules, because they come out of a historical, ethnographic, and even a co-evolutionary context. And the opportunity to use these medicines and integrate them into clinical practice needs to also acknowledge that they emerge from and they're most effective in a context of healing that is much more holistic than you usually find in medicine. Medicine tends to be very reductionist, and if we kind of instantiate the notion that, well, biological systems were just complex machines, right? And if you apply the right molecular monkey wrench, you can fix the machine, much like you might take your car to the garage to get fixed. It doesn't work that way. The medicines do have an effect. They are not the whole solution. It requires the fusion of other more holistic aspects of healing into the practice. And so this is a tremendous opportunity for clinicians to step out of their own boxes, which they have a hard time doing. But if they can do it with the help of plant medicines, I think this is one solution that clinicians who wish to use psychedelics in their practices, they should be, part of their qualifications should be that they afford themselves the opportunity to have these experiences in an indigenous context, and I think it will change the way they think about the way they're going to use these medicines in their own practice. And this is very important because these approaches are more effective. They actually work. People actually get healed. And the current approach in mental health care relies far too much on psychopharmaceuticals, where the message is, well, just take 2 and call me in the morning and these will fix you up, you know. It doesn't work that way for mental illnesses. So we need to, first of all, appreciate and acknowledge that more holistic indigenous approach, and then to the degree that we can, not just imitating it, but taking the portions of it and trying to integrate it into our own more effective healing modalities. You know, the current, I mean, psychiatry is a state of crisis, really, because most of the treatments don't work very effectively. Most of the psychotropic medications that they use are ineffective or barely more effective than placebo. None of them really get to what's required, which is getting to the root of people's problems, letting them have, you know, helping them to have insight into their problems so they can actually heal from them rather than just papering it over, which is what the current psychotropics tend to do. You know, they're a Band-Aid. They don't actually heal the wounds, though, that people suffer from. So I'm encouraged by this need. I mean, I hope it happens. I'm encouraged by the need to bring these traditions together and fuse the traditions. Indigenous people may be able to learn from the clinical approach, and the clinicians can certainly learn from the indigenous wisdom that these medicines come from.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing. I mean, thank you so much. I mean, I guess there's no doubt that you decriminalize a lot more in the US, and I guess that's one approach, but it's interesting to hear how they fit into the medical model. And I know we could talk about this all day, but I'm aware that you've got something to be pressing on with after this, Dennis. So we've got a bunch of different questions, but I think one that could be interesting is this one here from George, if you guys can see it on the screen. And I think it was more about the dieta for you, Ben. So for those that may not know, what happens when you choose to go on a journey of healing with plant teachers? What's the experience and what's the dieta you speak?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, that would give, that's kind of a topic which is complex and would give for a long time. So in a very, very brief way, you know, the plant dieta is a very, very sophisticated way of working with specific plant teachers or master plants. I now like to call them plant elders. But, you know, it's in a way, it's kind of the maestra part of the word. No? Planta maestra is really about kind of passing on wisdom, teaching, and healing. So these are very sacred plants that are, you know, way less known than the more typical ones like ayahuasca itself or iboga and so forth. And the way it works is that the healer kind of does a diagnosis before in an ayahuasca ceremony, and then basically there, because also the healer has dieted the plant for a long time, no, and so. Out of that experience and the direct connection that they have established with that plant, they then can feel or see what plant you should diet, no? And then there's a kind of a collaboration. So I would see, so if ayahuasca is a bit like a surgeon, you know, let's say, or a healer, then here you're talking about the whole team of healers coming together. So it's the master plant that you're dieting, and then it's the ayahuasca in the ceremonies, and then also it's the healer with the Icaros, you know, doing the work to kind of do the surgical and kind of helping for you to connect directly to that plant. But kind of the healers, the maestros are the plants. And it's very deep. I'm kind of, in my case, it really ripped out the root of kind of a trauma. I wasn't even aware that it had such an impact in my life. So it was kind of a surgical removing of the deep roots of the issues, which I only with ayahuasca never had experienced in such a deep way. No, the dieta is a way bigger commitment, you know, because you also have to dry fasting, and you know, you only eat once a day, and you can eat less, you know, if you dry fast for longer periods. It goes on afterwards. You have a post dieta period where the plant kind of, when it's really done in the proper way, you know, the plant continues kind of working with you. No, so it's really like having a new elder, no, a new grandfather who then keeps on teaching you and supporting you in your life. But I think the plant dietas, if it's done by the wrong person with the wrong intention, it can be highly damaging as well. Just like if you would do open heart surgery, you wouldn't want to go with somebody who doesn't know what he's doing, or somebody with a wrong intention. So I think there it's really also a note of care, not just you go to anybody. But yeah, for me, it's been the most profound and beneficial process I've ever had, which also is not isolated because it comes from personal work that I've done before. But yeah, it's kind of, and there's many different master plans, and so you diet one, you can't eat salt or sugar during anything, and then the diet is closed afterwards. It's just a whole very, very delicate intervention that's done. And so, touching upon what we were talking about before with Dennis as well, like, if somebody, we're dealing now with PTSD, with medicine that kind of, helps people, helps alleviate it somewhat more at the root cause. But, my personal experience now with the plant dieta is like, if clinicians would see the sophisticated manner in which in those plant dietas, traumas are really removed by, with the core, and even the whole somatic physical aspects that come with it, through kind of purging, which often is seen as a side effect, but really it's really key. The cleansing, deep cleansing of everything that traumas and past seeds that come from traumatic experiences or so forth grow in us. So just the whole way of working around trauma is, for me, the most sophisticated part I've seen. Just like also with my visits with the Umia communities in Colombia, the way they deal with community resilience and fracture healing and so forth, is not just, and I hear this very often, like, yeah, but this is their culture and we have another culture. For me, it's not like that. If you go there, you see the way they work around community resilience, or the surgery system of the Shipibo plant medicine, or the plant dietas. I think it's we can really learn from each other a lot, and just through curiosity and reciprocity, really revolutionizes the way we understand health. And I think for me that's really where the big promise lies. And as Dennis said, kind of psychedelics are a bit of a door that can be open to that. But I think we need to really make sure that it's not yet another form of extractionist, industry, which completely puts aside and kind of labels the indigenous healing systems around it, all of that knowledge, as somewhat folklore, or something of those strange communities, because it is really way more sophisticated than I even thought. In 10 years, having learned more and more from these indigenous communities, I've come more to that conclusion.
Right, quite so. And I think it's important to point out that most Westerners who go to South America to take ayahuasca, they don't do these plant dietas. They go, they have some ceremonies, and which are probably beneficial, at least we hope so. They take that perspective, and hopefully they can integrate it into their lives after they go home. We often say, the real work begins after the retreat is over, and the perspectives that they take, they can, some will just go home and get back into the same habits that they had before. Other people will take it to heart, but they're leaving a lot behind. It's rare that someone, from the West has either the time or the money or the motivation to go to one of these centers and spend some weeks during these dietas. But they are extremely valuable. And again, I look forward to the day when both the medicines and the indigenous knowledge can be essentially brought to centers in the West, in the Northern Hemisphere, and these methodologies can be implemented. Another interesting question that comes up is, if that happens, what plants will they use for the dieta? What of these maestra plants are available? So this is kind of an interesting challenge for to have an indigenous person come here and explore the local ecology and perhaps identify some plants that are locally available that can be used for dietas. Because I mean, that's one way, and I think that ayahuasca can be used powerfully within these centers. That's a whole other dimension to it that I think is important to implement. So there's a promise of a lot of exchange of knowledge, and if the approach to using plant medicines with ayahuasca as a tool, but then these dietas, which can be well designed, you could really enhance the healing that goes on, as well as it would help to make people aware of what is available in their own ecologies, in North America, that could fulfill this role. That really hasn't been looked at very much, but it's worth looking into.
Yeah, and I'm aware of some centers more in Europe, small ones, where people have done dietas with local plants. And then also, interestingly, there's one community that I know of. They have kind of partnered with indigenous. They kind of sometimes invite indigenous peoples to come to ceremonies, learning from that community. But also, they have started to recover kind of the relationship to the plants of the territory itself. More kind of the European, ancestral plants. And even in Brazil, there's the example of the Puyanawa who lost. They were, enslaved, taken off their territories. And then, it was through contact. Actually, I think it was with the Daime Church, but drinking ayahuasca in that context, that they reconnected to their land, and slowly, found it again. They found pottery, so they knew it was their ancestral territory, and kind of recovered their culture. So I think also there's a beauty in kind of when really, the worlds and peoples unite and come together, that we can even help recover, the knowledge and the wisdom that is lost everywhere, and even the Shipibo, they've lost the Muraya healer, which was the highest level healer. Now there's Onayas. The Muraya doesn't exist anymore. Oh, there's a bird. And there's some communities have been really devastated by the colonialism and poverty and so forth. So how can so I see it really as coming together in true alliance, reciprocal relationships, to kind of elevate everything collectively, and that's really what's needed. So yeah,
right. It's a very good point. European society and effectively European society, but then also the North American societies that were colonized by people from Europe. They all had plant traditions, and this has not really been acknowledged, or I mean, we know it exists, but in some ways we've lost contact with those traditions. So the plant medicines, with the help of indigenous healers, might be a way to reconnect with our own indigenous nature, in a sense, or at least the medicines that occur in our own ecologies, that the knowledge has been lost, or it's been lost to most people. There are, of course, plant medicine people in Europe who are trying to preserve these traditions. So it's interesting to hear Ben talk about groups that are trying to work out, dieta protocols with plants that are adjacent to where they live.
Topic of tradition is really interesting, and I guess it kind of takes us on to our next question. It's something that I mentioned kind of briefly earlier about bringing these medicines into the Western model, and does it strip them of their kind of their sacred element? And I guess that largely comes around ceremony. So our next question here is, how important is ceremony to the success of plant medicines in the Western context?
Well, I think ceremony is, in a way, it's a safety container. It provides context, which is important. There's definitely also uses of these plants without ceremony, and they can be beneficial too. But I think, these ceremonies, it's not for nothing that there's such concrete ceremonies. If you look at the Bwiti, for example, in Gabon with Iboga, it's like a 3 to 5 day ceremony. I mean, it's not just on one go, and you have several ceremonies in an initiation process, but it's so detailed. Everybody has a role, and it really provides a safety container, and is a key part in how the whole process is guided, of the initiative in that case, and how the community participates in that. So I think ceremony is an important role. I think we're lacking in general ceremonies in our culture, and we have also lost many of those. So one thing with ICERS we've been working on a lot is kind of more of the community model, which in Spain this was born around the cannabis social clubs, but in essence a non-profit user association model, which doesn't really decide on is it for kind of patients that come together and they want to drink ayahuasca together or Iboga, or is it for spiritual groups, or that's kind of open. But it is around community, and it provides kind of a safety container where people with similar interests can come together and use these plants together. No? And I think I'm very interested in how in our world we don't only kind of go through the FDA or the medical model, which is generally without kind of ritual assessed to it, but also provide legal frameworks in which people can kind of accommodate whether it's indigenous cultural settings or kind of more more Western cultural settings that people have created, or cross formats, incorporating different elements. But I think that's key, where we can also facilitate legal context for use within ritual framework. No, but I personally think that it's very it's very useful to use these plants within well-designed ceremonial frameworks, and that's what we've seen humanity do, for thousands of years. No,
right. This goes back to essentially to the old saws about set and setting. These psychedelics need to be taken in a well-orchestrated setting and with the right set, which is your mindset, what you bring to it, which is basically what you are, your whole previous experience, as well as your expectations for the ceremony. Because these medicines can't be used outside of a context. They need a vessel, a container, as Ben says, where this experience can happen safely and with support, whether that's a clinical therapeutic session or a ceremonial context, or some combination of those things. As long as it's respectfully constructed and carried out thoughtfully, it can be a combination of these things. But there definitely has to be a vessel to contain these experiences, which is one of the main things that sets apart these medicines from basically all other medicines that we take in biomedicine. None of them require a ceremonial effect. I mean, they might benefit from it, but it's definitely not intrinsic to it. We don't really have ceremonies around our use of antibiotics, for example. I mean, maybe we should, maybe it would help, but we just don't view it that way. But psychedelic medicines need to be used in a context. They need to be used within a container. And that's why they cannot be integrated into biomedicine until that changes, because the only way it's going to work is if the protocols, the therapeutic protocols, are changed to accommodate that. So and they are catalyzing this change. I mean, it's a slow process. I wish it was faster, but that is happening.
And also, sorry, one other small thing I wanted to add to that, which I think is crucial, and which also I learned and saw very clearly when I visited the communities in Colombia, the importance of accountability to your community. And, we see that with kind of shamans that are traveling all around. They do a tour, go from one place to the other. Some people do great work, and then there's others that they're not accountable to anybody. They're kind of the stars, and they move around. And so a lot of the problematic behavior that we're seeing, sexual abuses or just kind of, a bit of rock star behavior is really because of accountability to a community. And when I was with these communities in Colombia, they said that, for us, there's no thing as kind of a certification that you would give to a healer, a taita, and then they go off and see, I'm a healer. They said the only certification is the continued accountability to your community. And so, again, I think, ceremony provides a good framework, but also, community, and I think there's issues around people, narcissistic personalities, or those who are kind of trying to build fame and easily can abuse the power of being in the position of facilitating this deep spiritual experience to somebody. And I think it's very important that people are also aware of that. It's some groups, they do a lot of marketing there. There's all these messages around kind of power, and I think people should be aware of that and really looking at those who are accountable to others. It's always a good sign. Those who have a community around it, and it's not just the leader with all of the followers, but it's actually a vibrant and active participatory community. I think that's also key, that more can be developed to avoid some of the issues that we've had around the globalization of these plants as well.
It really just reminded me of a quote, actually, of your brother's, Dennis. It was follow plants, not gurus, or something along those lines.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. The plants are the real teachers.
Yeah.
You learn directly from the plants. The plants are doing the teaching. A good shaman or facilitator or someone, whatever term you choose to apply, the ones that know what they're doing will devote their energy to providing that optimal setting, and then they get out of the way. They let it happen. They don't intervene. They will use things like Icaros to modulate the session, but basically they give people maximum opportunity to learn directly from the medicine. And if they need support, then they are there to support them. In the traditional context, they don't tell you what you're supposed to experience, that's up to you. And that's the thing that's unique about psychedelics. Everyone's experience is intensely individual. You can't delegate somebody to have a psychedelic experience for you, because you have to take that into your heart, into your mind personally. You have to integrate that experience. You can delegate someone to have an experience and write you a full report on what happened. That's the scientific approach. But the investigator doesn't get the benefit of that, other than they get a full report. But it's not the same as having the experience. So, yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question, if that's okay with you. And this is one that came in at the beginning of the stream.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go pretty soon, but yeah.
Okay, quick summary on this. He clearly knows you, so hi Dennis, nice to see you again. Which is the main role ethnopharmacology can play in expanding the consciousness of the human race?
Well, I think we've been talking about this. I think that ethnopharmacology, is the scientific discipline. It's an inherently interdisciplinary kind of science. But I think ethnopharmacology is one of the ways we can learn about our interdependence with the world of nature. That's what you learn. That's what ethnopharmacology studies, is basically the use of all sorts of, it's not even confined to medicines. It's, as such, usually not confined to psychedelics, not even confined to medicines, because indigenous people they utilize many things in their environment that we wouldn't consider medicines, but it's properly the study of ethnopharmacology. arrow poisons, for example, or other types of remedies that might, the use of even fish poisons and that sort of thing. Ethnopharmacology can approach all of this. The point is, what good is it? It's good for two things. It's good for remembering what we already know and have forgotten, so we can go back and visit those things and maybe recover some of that knowledge. It also points toward the future. The whole idea of the ethnopharmacologic search for psychoactive drugs, the name of this symposium that we did, the emphasis is on search, and the search goes on. The search is not finished. There are still, for example, there are undoubtedly psychedelics to be discovered in nature that nobody knows about, or maybe there are reports. That's the challenge for ethnopharmacology in the future, is to not only preserve what we know, but also look at what we may not know yet. Try to bring that knowledge try to integrate that knowledge, make those discoveries. I mean, just in the sense that undoubtedly there are, for example, undiscovered in the rainforest, there are probably plants that could cure COVID, or a number of other problems. And there are certainly psychoactive plants that could be very important. And, these are maybe the most fragile in some ways, because that's where the knowledge tends to disappear first, is from the shamanic knowledge, especially if they're interfacing with Western institutions like missionaries and so on. Their agenda is to make people, first of all, to disrespect, and then encourage people to forget their traditional knowledge, and substitute some alien, foreign perspective, which is unfortunate, but that's what goes on. So I think ethnopharmacology has a bright future.
Thank you so much, guys. I'd love to continue. There's loads of other incredible questions coming in. I'm sure they won't stop, but I know that you have to depart now, Dennis.
I think so. Yeah. It's been a pleasure. Great talking with you and Ben. And
yes,
I hope that this goes far and wide. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me and being such a good moderator. Great questions. Thanks so to the listeners for asking great questions.
Well, hopefully you can join us at Medicine Festival perhaps in 2021. ICES are actually one of our official partners this year. Ben is going to be speaking there. We've got a psychedelic Sunday service with Ben and Satish Kumar and Graham Hancock and whatnot. So yeah, Medicine Festival is about much more than just psychedelics and plant medicine, however. It's about how we perceive medicine, as a species in a much wider context, and how we can kind of shift this narrative from what medicine currently is, from music to dance to ceremony to ritual, just celebrating life. It's about asking the question of how can we be the medicine? So we've got amazing days around systems change and new economy and listening to the land and envisioning the future. So yeah, Medicine Festival itself is a much wider context, and we actually are a community interest company. So all profits raised will go towards charities and organizations that support and empower indigenous communities, as you guys know fully well, those that represent and protect 80% of the world's rainforest. So really important. Our tickets are on sale right now still. We're still currently moving ahead and keeping our eye on global developments and current situations. But as a final disclaimer, however incredible and life-changing these medicines may be, of course, they're absolutely illegal in the UK, and we don't condone the consumption of them or any illegal substances for that matter. So thank you all so much.
Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted to mention that you're hosting the virtual fireside chats coming up. I know you have one tomorrow, I believe. I don't know if you want to quickly do an outro on that.
I have one tomorrow.
Yeah, with Bruce Damer and Luis Eduardo. Is that right?
Well, that was held some weeks ago. That was all part of the Tribute to Terence
I'm completely misinformed then.
No, those happen, but people can visit the website. We did, in the end, we did 5 different episodes with in collaboration with the San Francisco Psychedelic Society, and those are all recorded on the web. So there's no cost. They're totally open sourced, and I can send you the link offline, and people can review those anytime. They're just available.
Amazing. Well, we'll be sure to send those out. Anyone that wants to check these guys out, McKenna Academy, .academy, and of course ICES. You probably saw these both pop up.
Yes.
At the stream.
Write them down. Visit the websites and support, especially support ICERs. They're doing fantastic, effective work. So, and they'll use the money very wisely.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. And with that, over and out. And we'll see you guys next week, where we speak with Bruce Parry and Flourishing Diversities, and we see how indigenous wisdom can address current challenges. So thank you all, and we'll see you soon.
La, la.